Age Lead Store fans, this is Bill Rice again, bringing you some more sales training from Age Lead Store. Today, we're actually going to step back and literally define and talk in depth about what cold calling is. I am getting hammered with so many great questions about just the overall concept. Even though you guys, a lot of you are buying Age Leads, or in some way you're doing a high volume of calling, there definitely seems to be some lack of clarity as to what cold calling actually is and how to be successful at it. So we're going to cover all of that in today's video. All right, so let's jump right in. I'm going to start all the way back at the basics. When I played basketball, our coach always, whenever we screwed up a game, always took us back to the fundamentals, back to the basics, and that's what we're going to do today with cold calling. I know so many of you are already using Age Leads, or maybe using consumer data, or maybe you have been given or acquired a book of business. We get a lot of this from our insurance agents, but even some of our mortgage loan officers are experiencing this. And so the expectation is that they will be calling through these large volume lists, but I'm getting the sense that really a lot of us don't have a good understanding of what cold calling is. We don't have a comfort level that it's okay to cold call and that we're providing a useful service to the consumers that we're calling. And then ultimately, we haven't sort of developed a system or a mindset to be successful at cold calling. So I'm going to step through that step by step. One thing you can see right off the bat, I'm going to need a larger whiteboard. There's a lot to be covered here, but I want to give you all the tools to give you a foundation, and then week over week, we'll continue to build as we have been in these little individual niche areas and to improve your skills in the nuanced areas of overcoming objections, doing good openings, and all those sorts of things. But I want to give you a great foundation to start with, and so we're going to get a little more thorough with that, and it'll be a little bit longer. So let's start right at the beginning. What we're talking about today is what is cold calling. I want to make sure that we all have a clear understanding of what it is and why it's okay to do cold calling. Whether you're doing B2B or most of you are calling directly to consumers, that's okay too. And we're going to talk about that. And then ultimately, how to take this concept, this sales tool, this sales skill that we all should have. I've got really strong arguments that everyone should learn to be good at cold calling for a variety of other reasons, regardless of the type of sales you're in. You need to be good at it, and I'm going to tell you how to kind of build success around this skill and how to improve it, okay? So first thing, what is cold calling? I define this with three very specific things that to me would define what a cold call is and what it isn't, which is really important as we're kind of thinking about this concept. So a cold call is ultimately a call that you're making to someone that you've had no prior contact with, and that has shown no level of intent. So what I'm talking about this is, they haven't filled out a form on your website. You haven't purchased them from a real-time lead provider because there's a show of intent there. And even in the genre of aged leads, oftentimes we think we're actually making a cold call, but really by this definition, you're not, because at some point that consumer has shown some intent asking for someone from your industry, insurance or mortgage. They've asked for you to give them a call, to give them some information. So although I would categorize the skill set you need to work real-time leads, even real-time leads and age leads, but real-time leads too, I think sometimes we forget this. I would say the skill set is much like a cold call because they probably aren't expecting a specific call from you, but they do have this intent element, even when you're talking about age leads. So that's kind of a little bit of an advantage to actual traditional cold calling. So no prior contact. The consumer themselves haven't shown any level of intent. And as we get into the legal part, this becomes really important too, because generally most of the calls that you're going to be making are not actually truly cold calls. And then the third one The goal of cold calling, which I think is important to defining it, the ultimate goal of a cold call is to begin to create intent. So even on that first call, although some of you will be good enough and you'll be lucky enough to actually make one call closes, oftentimes when we're cold calling, that first initial call, just like when we're sending drip emails, that first initial drip email is to start to sort of tease out some intent or get them to a place where they realize they actually have a demand or a need or a want for your particular product or service. So when I'm defining cold calling, this is how I define it. They have the consumer, you've had no prior contact with the consumer, the consumer themselves have shown no level of intent, and then ultimately the goal is to begin to create that intent with your call. So this is one of the biggest questions that I get, and even if this isn't a question, even if you understand the answer to are cold calls illegal, I think a lot of times we have anxiety because sometimes when we make cold calls, the consumer, because they're not expecting it, right? We haven't had prior content, they haven't actually asked for the call in some cases. Sometimes they can get nasty and they can start to throw out things that sound, or the language they use sounds scary from a legal standpoint. So although I'm not a lawyer, and of course, you all should consult your attorneys or your general counsel for your organization to support you in the answer to this question. I'm going to tell you generally what the information is around cold calls. So first and foremost, cold calls are not illegal. So it's tried and true. It's very American to be entrepreneurial and to reach out to potential consumers and share what you have to sell and what you have to offer to them. So that's something that's just kind of embedded in the nature of the American way. So I don't think at any point in time cold calls will become illegal. But it is important to understand, although it is not legal, and there is a subtle difference between regulation and something that is criminally prohibitive, right? So there is regulation that manages how we should be making these types of cold calls, these type of sales calls, but it is in no way prohibited. And that's generally the case in other markets as well, in the UK and Canada and that sort of thing. So there are regulatory restrictions around cold calling, but it is not prohibited. So in order for you to feel confident in doing this kind of sales calling, it's important for you to kind of understand the rules, which are very reasonable and very almost intuitive. They're just kind of basic politeness, I would call them. But there are some rules that we need to follow. So let me go through those real quick. And I will put some links in here. Actually, this is controlled. This regulatory environment is controlled by the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, the same people that control generally sales and marketing practices. But there's actually a really nice kind of line by line breakdown of this on the SEC site, which actually regulates investment activities, which I think that's there because a lot of financial advisors and investors have a tendency to cold call. But anyway, here's the basic rules. You should be doing all of your calling between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m. of the actual time zone that you're calling into. This is generally very easy to do in most CRMs. When you put in a contact, some of these are even done. It gets a little bit confusing sometimes by the portability of phone numbers, but either by the phone number or the address, generally your CRM will sort of correct for that and make sure that you're calling within the appropriate time and can lock out those leads, or you can actually program that in. I know when I use Close.io, which is now Close.com, one of my favorite tools for sales, CRM, they actually, I had the ability to program that in. So I wouldn't even see a lead unless it hit this window. And of course, then 9 p.m., that's even kind of late. Generally, we don't do this, but we'll talk about, I've got another video coming up where I'm going to actually talk about kind of the most productive times to call, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, that's generally your window, 8 a.m. in the morning till 9 p.m. Number two, you should always clearly and correctly and accurately introduce yourself. Your name, your company, your affiliation. That's something that we put in each and every one of our scripts. So this should just go without saying. Where I see sales salespeople get in trouble is when they lack confidence in what they're selling and they try to be somewhat deceptive. And so you absolutely do not want to do that. And we'll talk about that in a second. You want to respect the do not call rules, right? So although we do our best and every organization has different requirements and processes by which they enforce the do not call registry system, if someone tells you that, hey, I don't want to be called, or I'm on the DNC list and for whatever reason your system hasn't caught that, then just be polite, right? Just be polite and say, I will take you off our list. And usually that solves the problem. But in all cases, you want to do your level best to respect those people who have intentionally said, I do not want to be called. Any sales have to be confirmed in writing. So what this means is if somebody says, yep, I'll buy it, you can't actually confirm the transaction verbally via a phone call, right? It generally, this is just good practice even for your own business. Generally, there needs to be a process of signing a contract or some sort of signature. It could be DocuSign or that sort of thing, but you can't confirm and settle the transaction and sort of truly close the deal on the phone. There needs to be some sort of contractual transaction that takes place to confirm that actual sales and the exchanging of money. And then last but not least, this kind of goes back to all these things that we're saying here. Don't lie, right? Don't be deceptive. We talk about this over and over again. People respect and you're trying to build trust. That's a fundamental thing that you're trying to do with sales, is trying to build trust and credibility with your client. So ultimately, it just makes tons of sense. Don't lie, right? Don't lie about who you are. Don't lie about where you're from, and don't lie about your goal or your objective of this particular call. So that's kind of what cold calling is, to give you a good framework on which we're going to build success. So now let's flip over to the success side of the chart and talk about what creates a successful cold call. So just kind of a list here, and I'll talk about each and every one of these. But this is where you should start to sort of take some notes. And this is going to help you build out your process and your system for actually doing cold calls. It will help you construct your sales scripts as well. So encourage you to take some notes here. And of course, as always, our whiteboard will be in there as an image, so you'll be able to look over it again. Know your numbers. Cold calling unquestionably is a game of large numbers. So I think it's really important, if you're going to cold call, that you really have an understanding of what it's going to take in order to meet your number. So often I'll get people that will tell me stories of, hey, or even watch them or observe how they do. When I had a sales team, I would watch the floor, and you would see some people that just kind of haphazardly made calls, and they felt like, I'm doing something and therefore I will eventually hit the quota. But you actually have to go backwards and do the math. I encourage you to do that. You want to go with, hey, this is how many deals that I need to close this month in order to hit my quota. And then you need to back out and start to do that math. There's some worksheets. I could probably share one or two of those with you. But then you need to figure out, okay, in order to get that many closed deals, how many calls, actual contacts do I need to make? How many contacts? So you're starting to kind of back in the conversion rate. So you say, okay, how many deals do I need to close? And figure out, okay, on average of the people that I talk to, what is my conversion percentage? So if I actually get them on the phone, what is the percentage chance, hopefully you have some numbers, what is the percentage of those people that I actually am able to convert generally in any given month? So then that gives me the number of people I need to talk to. And then you look at, depending on the types of data that you're using, and we'll talk about that at the very end, but the type of data that you're actually calling on, you need to understand, of the data that I have in my call list, how many calls does it take in order to make that many connections, to actually talk to that many people? And again, you just back out that conversion rate as well. So, and then ultimately you come up with this number that says, hey, in this month, I need to call 3,000 people in order to get there. And then of course you got to break that down by business day and figure out, like, do I need to make 50 calls a day? Do I need to make 80 calls a day? Do I need to make 100 calls a day? Where I see people making mistakes is they just start calling and they're like, 20 calls feels like a lot, and they do it, and then they get to the end of the month, they made 20 calls every single day for the 20 business days in the month, but then they find out that because of the conversion rates that they have or the quality of their skills at any given point, wow, they weren't even close to the number of calls they needed to make. Instead of 20 a day, because of their skill set or because of the data that they're calling on, they need to make like 100 or maybe even 200. So you've got to do your numbers. You have to understand your numbers, or you will always fall short. You will be amazed, especially if you're cold calling. Quantity is everything. And then of course, you're going to get better and better. So all those numbers are going to improve, but you got to start with quantity. In all cases, when you're talking about cold calling, I would always tell you, just for the practice and the quality and the improvement of your sales skills, you should be getting really close to 100 calls a day if you're going to use this technique. So number 2, create call blocks. This is another big mistake I see people making with cold calling. So they'll go in and they'll spend 8 hours calling, and that is horribly inefficient, because you truly will not spend 8 hours calling. And there's a whole variety of reasons. Some of this we'll talk about here in a second, of reasons that you just cannot physically or mentally call after call after call after call after call for 8 hours, nor do you need to do that. So set up call blocks. My suggestion, 30-minute to an hour call blocks. That's it. Take a break. But those 30 minutes or an hour, whatever your call block is, they need to be super intense. You need to maximize the number of calls that you can make in that time, which means quality CRM, click to dial, headsets. You got to kind of have all the tools in place so that you can just whip through, make those 100 calls a day, but only spend perhaps 3 hours, 3 call blocks actually on the phone. And then in between, you're going to do some other stuff to make those cold calls more effective. But create call blocks. Don't just sit there and idly call, because what's going to happen is you're going to dial a few, then you're going to surf some Facebook, and you can check on the web, you're going to check your email, then you're going to dial another one. Plus there's some call anxiety or hesitation in between there. So that's going to delay you actually hitting the button to make the call. So there's all kinds of reasons to create these intense, what we used to call power hours of calling, and use those exclusively. Don't just kind of randomly, haphazardly dial throughout the day. Use a script. Always use a script. Think about what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, but I would encourage you to do it in the form of an outline, because whenever I'm talking about scripts, and you probably heard me talk about this before, when you're using a script, you should be using it like an actor, right? You're supposed to get some detail around what you want to say and the different types of things that you'll present, and potentially the different types of responses that you will get. But all of that should be in the form of an outline, because you want it to feel natural in its delivery. But in all cases, use a script. Don't just wing it. No matter how good a salesperson you are, I've been selling for decades and I still use a script when I'm actually making calls, right? Practice your opening. Practice. In all cases, I talk about this all the time too. You can put it on paper, it can look beautiful. You can maybe even read it back to yourself, but when you actually open your mouth and say it out loud, and practice it, a lot of times it becomes a train wreck, right? So you want to take that outline and you want to practice it, and specifically, because you only have a split second to get it right, you want to practice that opening over and over and over again. And probably even a couple of natural opening objections are really good to train through that. So practice your openings. Overcome call anxiety. This will actually do a lot. Creating your call blocks will help come over that call anxiety. So what I'm talking about is you're looking at the phone, or you're looking at your screen now in this modern age, and like the hardest thing to do is to click that first phone number, right? Because you're just thinking about all the things that are going to happen next, right? You're like, they're going to yell at me. I'm not going to hear anything but dial tones. So all those negative emotions and thoughts about cold calling are going to going to be in your head. And that's why it's important to have these intense call blocks, because when that time hits, it's like a starting block, right? As soon as that time hits, you want to hit the call button and you want to go. And ideally, you have an auto dialer so you don't even have the opportunity to stop until you make an intentional effort. Because once you get into that flow, you start making calls, whether you're having success or not, and we're going to talk about the no's here in a minute, you will be in a flow, right? You won't have that anxiety. So that's what's going to get your call volume up. But if you haphazardly make a call and then after that call, you get up and take a break, boom, you got to overcome that call anxiety again. And that's probably easily anywhere from 5 minutes to a half an hour. That anxiety is going to take up and out of your call day. So that's why I talk about, like, don't just randomly call throughout the day. Have those intense call blocks where you're like, I am not going to get out of this chair until I'm finished with my call block. The other thing that's important in overcoming call anxiety and why not to sort of stop, so you have to get over this again, is if you actually get a sale, this is a little trick that I got from, I think, Steli FT from Close.io said this, which is genius, or maybe it was somebody. Anyway, I don't know where I got this from, so hopefully forgive me for attributing it incorrectly, but what they said was that whenever they made a sale, they saw their sales team generally, when a sale was closed or they had a successful call, that person was relieved and they would get up and they would take a break and they would celebrate. And instead he said, no, when you get that success, use that as traction and keep pushing forward instead of interrupting and creating, again, that call anxiety. Because even though you had a success, 5 minutes later, you try to get back on that phone, you're going to be delayed because you're going to be thinking about, again, all the negative thoughts as well. Okay, embrace the no. This is super important. You're going to get lots and lots of no's when you're talking about cold calling. And you just have to understand that, one, the no's have nothing to do with you. Those no's have everything to do with that customer's particular day, what's going on in their life, their needs as a business. There's a whole variety of things that leads them to say no. And 99% of those no's have absolutely nothing to do with you personally and nothing to do with your sales skill. Those no's are because that consumer is not in the right state of mind to say yes or to use your product or service. So that's okay. A no is okay. The more no's you get through, the faster you'll get to yes. So that's super important to just change your mindset that a no has absolutely nothing to do with you, certainly personally, and probably not your sales skills either. Asking open-ended questions, you're opening the floor, you're going to learn so much more about what will make that consumer, that customer buy from you if you open the floor so that they can talk freely and they feel like they're the one that's supposed to be talking. A lot of times as salespeople, we just talk over and talk through our script and don't ever pause to listen to them and let them talk. But if you ask open-ended questions, it will allow them to expose to you opportunities and angles to actually understand what it will take for them to buy or what they really need in order to be comfortable with your solution. Use trigger events or lead with context. This is another thing that I think oftentimes gets forgotten in the case of cold calling. Whenever you're calling on a lead, you should always have some sort of context or some sort of reason that you're calling. The worst kind of cold call is when you call someone and you just lay into the product that you're selling or the service that you're selling, and the person on the other end of the line goes, what in the world made you want to call me today, right? So depending on the type of calling or the type of sales that you're doing, trigger events could be a particular season, open enrollment. So you're saying, hey, I'm calling you because it's the open enrollment period and you have a limited period of time in order to consider your health insurance needs and those sorts of things. So that's like a triggering event. But it can be something even less obvious than that. Oftentimes with our aged leads clients, we'll see people, they'll get aged leads, but they don't leverage the triggering event or the context that's inherent in that aged lead file. So in that file, you know when they actually submitted their real-time inquiry or request. So I always make my call in context with that. So if it was a couple months ago buying 60-day-old leads, guess what my opening is going to be? Hey, this is Bill Rice. I'm calling from XYZ Mortgage Company, and I just wanted to reach out to you because a couple months ago, you had asked about refinancing your mortgage, and I wanted to see if you were able to do that. Or a couple months ago, you reached out and made an inquiry online, or reached out and asked online for some rate quotes around purchasing a new home. Have you purchased a new home? Are you still thinking about purchasing a new home? So even within that cold lead file, there is some context. And when you give that context to the customer, then they'll be more likely to engage with you because they understand, oh, this is why they're calling. That makes sense. Yes, I did apply online a couple months ago, so it makes total sense that you would call me. Or, oh, yeah, I didn't realize open enrollment's now, but if that's something that I need to consider, like I understand why you're calling me at this point in time. So try to place that call in context and give them a good reason to know why you're calling. Once you're on the call, here are some key things that you should always be thinking about that will make each call more successful. For each and every call, or the actual list that you're calling at any given time, so it may be a defined list that you've kind of shaped, understand the goal that you're trying to achieve. So if they're brand new age leads, that you've just bought and they're 60 days old, your goal is probably to start to create intent or to re-engage with them and lead them into your book of business versus whoever called them before. And so you're kind of trying to, your goal for each of those calls is to pivot them into your book of business, to get them in the mindset that you're their provider, you're their expert, their mortgage expert, you're their insurance expert. And so that's kind of the goal of that call. Maybe it's people you're calling through a list where you've actually made some contact before, or maybe they're past clients and you've actually sold them a product before. So the goal of that particular list that you've formulated for that day is, hey, I want to introduce them to a second product. And it's this particular product because I pulled everybody that bought this product. Maybe they bought term life insurance for them, and maybe now I want to talk to them about some other sort of complementary product. So in all cases, when you build out your call list, make sure you have a goal. Use stories. There's the fastest way to get somebody engaged with you is to tell them a story. It's also the easiest way to sort of remember your script. So put together a few different stories, and generally these are going to be stories about how you've helped other clients or how you've done things. So if somebody actually in an open-ended question leads you, hey, yeah, kids are just graduating from high school and now they're going to college or whatever. And so you pull out your story that says, oh, for all those people that are just became empty nesters, like this is a story I need to tell, or this is how I've helped other empty nesters improve their insurance situation. So stories are everything. Questions, same thing with questions. Don't sit there with your script and tell them, lecture them. I hear this all the time, especially in the financial services industry, because we generally know more than the customer does about financial services and products and the complexity of these products. Oftentimes I'll hear salespeople, they're just hammering on the information. They're like, I'm just lecturing them like I'm some sort of college professor and trying to impart on them. And you're trying to do a service. It's not like you're trying to do something bad. You're like, oh, they need to know this and this and this and this and this. And so it turns into a lecture instead of you asking them questions about what they need, what concerns them, what they're looking for. And all those questions can then be pivoted into stories about how you can help them, which those stories will inform them of all that educational stuff that you want to get out to them. So lead with questions. Embrace silence. This is another thing we're not really good at. Moments of silence drive us crazy, right? Even for me, that moment to hold that silence there for a second, I felt like I should be saying something because I don't want to make this video too long. I want to get all this information to you, but just holding that silence there will open the floor for the customer to start to talk back to you and to get engaged and involved. Your tone, I like to make calls standing up there is something to be said with the tone that comes into your voice. So you want to be thinking positively, you want to be smiling, you want to be standing up. All of that comes through in your delivery, even on the phone, and people can hear it. Avoid easy outs. I hear people doing this all the time. Even when I get sales calls, I'm amazed at how easy some folks let me off the hook. In fact, some cases they'll say, hey, this is so-and-so, I'm selling this. I was like, hey, it's really kind of not the best time. And they're like, hey, can I send you something? And boom, that's it. They're off the call. I'm like, oh, sure, you could send me something. But that was the easy out. Instead of saying, hey, they say, hey, it's not a good time. Well, I've got some information that I would love to send you. Will you get a chance to look at it this week? And if so, what's the best time to kind of call you back and try to schedule an appointment, right? So try to avoid those easy outs. So lead with them. No one likes to be sort of pulled along by the nose. So you want them, and open-ended questions help you do this. The stories will help you do this. It'll allow them to tell you things that indicate where they want to go. And then you just kind of walk alongside of them. And so leading with them, I think, is a great way in order to move the conversation forward and move towards your goal without them feeling like they're being drug along. Listen, of course, this makes a ton of sense. You need to be listening. This is silence and listening actually kind of go together. I used to tell some of my folks on the sales team is the person who talks first loses, right? So use that silence so that you are actually building in time for your customer, your prospect to talk back to you and for you to listen. Sometimes I'll even do little things like, hey, we'll be talking along or whatever. They're telling me some things about their needs, and I'll pause, I'll use a little silence, and I'll say, hey, just give me a second, I'm taking some notes, right? And they'll hear my keyboard clicking, and that's a really sort of trusting, credible, reinforcing moment because they're listening, they're actually taking notes, and of course you should be actually taking notes in your CRM, but that's a great way to make sure that they understand that you're listening, and you make sure that you're capturing the information, so the next time you call them or the next time you engage with them, they'll actually understand that you were listening. Don't waste their time, right? If you hit a brick wall, or you run into an issue where it's just not a fit, you don't want to waste their time and you don't want to waste your time. So kind of early on in that conversation, you should be doing some qualifying. The worst thing that you can do is if there's no fit, that they should not be wasting their time with you. Nor do you want to keep them on the phone and realize you don't have a product to sell them. Stay on track. So stories are great, and you definitely want to wander into the personal all the time, but make sure that although your sales call is sort of a wandering path, that path is actually headed in the right direction, and you keep it on track. In all cases, be positive. I can't tell you how important this is. It's easy in cold calling to get frustrated, to even get irritated, to get offended or upset, or to have some irate customer in your head. You got to flush that out. You got to be positive. And that's where call blocks will help you as well. 30 minutes to an hour, man, it's really easy to kind of pump yourself up and make sure you're positive for that period of time. But it's super important. It's going to come through in your tone and all these other things. Okay, last thing that I want to cover in order to really give you a firm foundation of cold calling and why it's important is to talk about the success rate of cold calling and how to or what makes it effective or why you should be doing it. So, success rate, people are always like, what percentage of these should convert? Okay, a lot of that is trial and error. You have to track your numbers and you have to know your numbers so that you can kind of do your numbers up here. But what I will tell you is there's a direct correlation to certain types of data or lists that you will call on and higher conversion or percentage rates for a whole variety of reasons. So it is useful to kind of walk through that hierarchy and talk about it just a little bit. Of course, your success rate, when I'm talking about conversion, actually doing a deal, is going to be highest with referrals, right? Somebody that's worked with you or knows you very well, has endorsed you, and generally at a very high conversion rate in your 70 to 80%, you should be able to convert that referral into an actual deal, especially if they have the need. Obviously, you're going to get some referrals where it's just not a fit, right? But generally, if they're a qualified lead and you get a referral, that should be a slam dunk. Another one that should be relatively high is if actually you get an inbound lead. So someone's come to your website or they come to Facebook and talk to you on Messenger, but somehow they've reached out to you, they maybe call in to you. If they've actually reached out to you and picked you already, you've been through some series of filters. And again, there's probably a very good chance that that will turn into a closed deal as well, because they've kind of already done some of that filtering. And of course, they have that intent. So in both of these cases, generally intent is built in. You've already been run through a filter, so you have some trust and credibility built into that initial inquiry. And then ultimately, hopefully, it's qualified, right? Then we start to sort of rapidly degrade as far as conversion rate is concerned, and where you have to have this cold calling skill. This is my big pitch for why you have to be a good cold caller, is because after these two, in my mind and in my philosophy, you're cold calling, right? And you might be surprised that I've got real-time leads here. Like, well, real-time leads, I shouldn't be cold calling, right? And this is where it's really important, because you're actually in the point of sort of buying, even up here in inbound leads, if you're using something like PPC or SEO in order to get that inbound lead, to some degree, you're kind of working on a cold call there as well, because there's kind of been something that pushed them in to your funnel, but they may not entirely know who you are. But definitely as you get to real-time leads, they're off on some random site. They definitely had intent. They want to have a callback from you, but they don't know who you are. So for all intensive reasons, there's intent here, but they don't know who you are. There is no trust and credibility built yet. And so these all are cold calls in my, as far as how you build them, how you have success with them. Even with a real-time lead, you need to be good at cold calling, or these real-time leads are not going to convert, right? Aged leads is really the same thing. There's a little bit of time in between these. That's by definition the aged part of the leads. But essentially, and I've seen this happen, sometimes, depending on your system, aged leads can almost convert as well as the real-time leads. I mean, I've seen people that convert real-time leads at 2-3%, right? You can do that with aged leads for sure, if you get the system right. Of course, sometimes people, even the best of people at real-time leads, are probably only getting them up into that 5, maybe 10%, because you got to layer onto that. There's kind of some offsetting factors here. Layer into here, there's like 4 or 5 people competing, right? So you've got competition. You've got sort of overload. These people are getting hammered, with a bunch of calls real quick. There's a lot of anxiety that gets built up. So there's some offsetting factors here. So in a lot of cases, your cold calling success rate on real and aged leads can get really close together. And in fact, I tend to open them and try to open them up or do my initial welcome to them in a slightly different way. But my processes for real-time and aged leads don't really look that much different. And then, of course, ultimately consumer data. This is like real cold leads, right? This is actually consumer data that's been assembled. If you've ever been in the B2B market, this is what you kind of live off of. And ultimately, it's going to be very low. You're talking like sub 1% conversion rate, because you're just picking people out of the phone book, basically, and trying to do your best to segment them down to somebody that should be interested in your product, but for a whole variety of reasons, they're probably not. And of course, there's no intent built in there. So this is the toughest and really low. So by understanding that, so up in here, you're talking, in the upper quartile. If we break these into 4 chunks, the upper quartile, quartile, so 75 plus, right? When you get into real-time and age leads, you're moving down into that probably that bottom quartile. And then when you talk about consumer data, you're like kind of sub-bottom quartile. You're really trying to make some magic happen there, and you have to have a system. And when I talk about systems, you've seen my funnels in my system building videos, hopefully. If not, take a look at them. But you're talking about email, you're talking about social media, you're talking about maybe some paid or some SEO and a website, and then you're talking about the cold calling. So you got to have all those things working together. So is cold calling effective? I would say unequivocally yes, with the caveat with a system. So make sure you take a look at those systems videos, because it's super important to have all these things working together. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. We covered a ton of content about cold calling, but this is going to give you a Loctite foundation, give you a reference point. You can go back and look at this as we dive into some of the more individual aspects of actually succeeding here and start to break down some of these individual points. But I wanted you to have this foundation in this longer video. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. As always, hit that like button. Love to get the likes. If you have any questions, please ask them below. And just to give you a question, I want to know how many people are cold calling. If you are cold calling right now in your sales system, put yes, I'm cold calling. If the answer is no, then put no, I'm not cold calling. And tell me why. Like, what's holding you back? Because I'd love to get in there and answer that and maybe push you over or get through that block that is holding you back from actually making those cold calls and be successful. It's such an important part of this. And then ultimately, make sure you subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next week with another sales training video.